Okay, speaking of the comma, this is probably the most complicated piece of punctuation, and I always have to make sure I save this one for last whenever I'm explaining it to my students in the classroom, just because this is the section of punctuation where they take the most notes. The comma, to be used properly, there are some things that have to be understood about it. So let's get out of the way some of the very basic ways that the comma is used that most people are already familiar with. So commas are used to separate items in a series where there are 3 or more items listed. That's pretty simple. Now if you only have 2 items that you're listing, you don't use commas, you just use and. So if you were saying that you went to the store to get bread and milk, that's it. You don't need any commas there. Example, I had to pick up eggs, bread, juice, and cereal at the store. So because we've got 3 plus things that we're listing here that we picked up from the store, we are separating each of these items with commas. Commas also separate the date from the year in the month, date, year format, and they separate city and state. They are used in opening and closing salutations for letters and memos. So example, August 9th, comma, 2014. Another example here is if you were to write the date with the day, month, date format, then you could say Saturday, comma, August 9th. Also, please notice at the end of 9th, we actually have that little th, that suffix there. That should never appear in the above format. So if you write the date with the month, date, comma, year, don't put that little suffix on the number. That's not supposed to be there. But if you write it like this with the day of the week and the month and the date, then you can put it. And then also Dallas, comma, Texas, or Dallas, comma, capital TX, with the abbreviation for Texas there, but you always separate city and state with a comma. And Dear Jane, comma, and also Sincerely, comma, Paul. Commas separate off introductory phrases or words in a sentence. Most of these phrases or words provide a time or condition for something else that's mentioned later on in the sentence. So example, however, I did end up buying the other shoes for half off. And yesterday, comma, I visited my grandmother. Commas separate clauses in a sentence. And if you don't know what a clause is, please view my video on sentences and sentence types because I explain it in there. But basically, a clause is a sentence part. And there are different types of clauses, but commas separate those out. So when a dependent clause comes first, it separates the dependent clause from the independent clause. So with this first example, after I cooked dinner, comma, I folded the laundry. After I cooked dinner is a dependent clause, and then I folded the laundry is an independent clause. So the way that sentence is structured, the dependent clause is coming first, and we separate that from the rest of the sentence with a comma. Now, with the second example, I was late for work this morning because there was traffic on the freeway. This one also has 2 clauses because we have the subordinating conjunction because in this sentence, which denotes another clause starting. However, the dependent clause comes after the independent clause in this sentence. So we don't need to separate these 2 with a comma here. When 2 independent clauses are combined with the use of a coordinating conjunction or a fanboy, commas separate the 2 clauses. And these commas are working in tandem with the coordinating conjunction. So first example there says, my car broke down, comma, so I had to buy a new one. Second example says, Sarah bought a radio for Sam, comma, and I bought new sneakers for my cousin Jill. So we have 2 independent clauses in both of those examples for each sentence. Those are separated with a comma and a coordinating conjunction or a fanboy. Commas also separate out non-essential information in a sentence, and so this is kind of reminiscent of what I just talked to you about with the dash, and how the dash can be used to separate out non-essential information as well. With the dash being used to separate non-essential information, it's almost like putting more emphasis on that non-essential stuff. The comma can do the same thing as well. There's just not as much emphasis placed when you do that. But non-essential information, as I mentioned to you before, this is anything that can be removed from the sentence without altering the sentence's meaning. So the first example states, my house, comma, which has a white door, comma, needs painting. So The middle part there that's offset by the commas, which has a white door, if I take that out, the meaning of the sentence still stays the same. But I can separate this stuff out because it's not essential to the meaning of the sentence. Also, second example, Dr. Briley, comma, whom I've never met, comma, is leading the lecture. So again, we can separate out the information that's in the middle and between the commas there and take it out of the sentence, and the sentence's meaning still stays the same. However, because it's not essential to the sentence, we need to just make sure that we offset that information with the commas. Commas also separate out appositives, and appositives provide additional information about a noun. So this is almost similar to the very last example that I just gave you with Dr. Briley. A little bit different though, because it provides additional information about whoever that person is or whatever that thing is, whatever the noun is. So example, Michael, comma, my brother, comma, is a lawyer. So here the appositive is the part of the sentence that says my brother, because this is telling us additional information about who Michael is. The second example, the valedictorian, comma, a cancer patient, comma, had not missed any class during her entire 4 years of attendance. So again, a cancer patient is telling us more information about who the valedictorian is. And so in both of those instances, that information gets offset by commas. Here's some things to keep in mind about commas. Okay, if there's anything that drives me crazy, it's when people use way too many commas in their writing. I realize that the comma has a place. We don't want to do away with it altogether, and I definitely don't want to tell people not to use commas ever. However, you don't need to put a comma into every single piece of writing all the time, everywhere. Not every sentence requires a comma. You have to use them properly. So it's not a good idea to litter your writing with unnecessary commas. If you're not changing direction or adding new information, and you're not separating out any clauses or any sort of introductory information or anything like that, you don't need to use commas. And I want to show you this sentence because this is one where at first glance people are like, oh yeah, this is fine. But then when you actually examine this for what this sentence is doing, you start to figure out that, wait, maybe some of these commas can go away. So example, the Park Service, comma, does not allow anyone, comma, who does not have a proper camping permit, comma, to use this campground, period. How many of those commas do you think are necessary in that sentence? You might be surprised. Do we change direction anywhere in that sentence? I don't think so. Do we add new information anywhere in the sentence? No, we don't. Is there more than one clause in the sentence, which is usually denoted by the use of a conjunction, which I don't see any. I don't see any fanboys. I don't see any subordinating conjunctions. We're definitely not listing anything in this sentence, so that one's out. I don't see the date. I don't see city and state. Yeah, so none of the stuff that's listed here is happening in this sentence, which means that we don't need any of the commas that are in this sentence. They can all go away. This sentence is fine without commas. People tend to think that if you have a longer sentence, you need to have commas somewhere. Not necessarily true. Unless you're hitting some of these areas that I've highlighted here in bullet points, you don't need to include commas in a sentence that's long. Now, do make sure that you use commas when it's appropriate, because the meaning of what you write can be drastically changed if you take out commas. So with the appositive, I have an example here. Gretchen, comma, my grandmother, comma, was a welder. So this is an example of another appositive because my grandmother is telling us additional information about who Gretchen is. However, in the second sentence here, Gretchen, comma, my grandmother was a welder. That one's a little bit different because it seems that we are now addressing Gretchen and explaining to her that my grandmother was a welder, whereas before, in the first example, Gretchen is my grandmother in that one. But all of that happens just by omitting one simple comma. And also when it comes to addressing people, make sure that you make that very clear as well. So, and this is always my funny example that I like to use, but there's a very big difference between let's eat, comma, mommy, versus let's eat, mommy. In the first one, we're telling mommy that we want to eat. In the second one, I think mommy's the entree there.